All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the ANZALONE show. And I have a ton of stuff to talk about on today's show. It seems like since I was last on Wednesday, I could have done 10 shows and still felt like I have just a pile of clips to work through. There's so much happening, and there's a lot of coverage of it too. So I wanted to make sure that I took a somewhat unique track with my coverage of the big events of the weekend on today's show. Of course, that was Trump, Zelensky, Vance going at it in the Oval Office. I was actually covering this for antiwar.com over the weekend, so I published several articles dealing with this. The initial clash, this disagreement, the press conference, is at the last 10 minutes of, I think, a 40-minute presser. And for the first half hour of it, I was watching it kind of wondering what I was going to write about this press conference. There was a slight disagreement where Zelensky basically said he was unwilling to make concessions, and Trump said both sides would have to, but this wasn't any kind of big deal. And it wasn't until near the end where things really start to go off, where we have a very heated exchange between Vance and Zelensky, and then Trump and Zelensky. And truly, to watch it was unbelievable. Even after Zelensky had clearly been told to stop talking by Donald Trump, he continued to go at it. I mean, we could get into, and we will throughout this show, what my actual thoughts are on the things that were said during that exchange war. But just for Zelensky to not understand that when Donald Trump, the president of the United States, the country that has given you close to $200 billion in military support over the past 3 years, and the current president, Donald Trump, is considering whether to continue that program. The idea that you think talking over him, disagreeing with him, insulting his vice president is a smart decision, a smart road to go down, was truly something baffling, the whole exchange. Now, one of the other kind of shocking things after it was a lot of European leaders came out and gave their support to Zelensky and not Trump. I really thought that this was one of the most strange things to come out of the whole affair. Wasn't that the European leaders saw this as an opportunity to, also back away from Ukraine, but rather they're also going to thumb their nose at the Americans. This actually provoked Mike Lee, Thomas Massie, a Republican senator and a representative, as well as Elon Musk over the weekend, to call for the U.S. to leave the North Atlantic Alliance. I think it's this is like compounding a mistake. And so I really do think there's going to be repercussions from this, heated exchange, this contentious debate, this argument in the Oval Office between Trump and Zelensky for at least months to come, especially if the Europeans decide to, try to thumb their nose at Trump, to try to insult Donald Trump by taking more the side of Ukraine. I think that's going to be a real mistake here. So let's start to get into the clips that I have lined up today. Before I start playing them, just want to remind everyone to share the show wherever you're listening. If you're watching on ads, I know that's how most people tend to watch live. Go ahead and repost it. If you really like the show, you want to make sure you catch every episode, go to the YouTube channel and subscribe. That is the best way to interact with the channel. If you want to, leave comments during the show, we're open to that. If you have ideas for clips that you'd like to see me break down on future episodes, best place to drop them is in the comment section of the show. Just make sure you're subscribed, you're liking, you're helping us out with the algorithm and to kind of break through and get this new show out there to everyone. So let's go ahead and play the first clip we have today. This is CNN host Fareed Zakaria.
From the nation's beginnings, Americans have usually known whom to root for, those who sought freedom, and whom to condemn, those who tried to crush liberty.
So this guy gets on CNN and he's supposed to be taking the moral high road. He's presenting himself as the adult in the room, and he's talking about a war where there's hundreds of thousands, if not millions of deaths, hundreds of thousands of injuries, just horrific, grueling things going on, cities being destroyed. Bombs are going off not only in Ukraine, but Russia too. Russian civilians have died. What is happening is truly horrific in Ukraine. And he says Americans should know who to root for. Like in every war, what you should do is look at it and pick a side and cheer for it like you would your favorite football team. This is the most immature, juvenile, second grade style of thinking that you could possibly have for a conflict. And yet this is, somebody rolled out as the liberal opposition to Donald Trump, the mature, the responsible, the smart, the principled. And this is what they're saying. Americans should know who to root for, but now that's all in question because Donald Trump decided that he prefers ending this conflict than seeing it go on forever. But Zakaria wasn't done there, so let's go ahead to the next clip.
America as a superpower sometimes acted unwisely in places like Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan. But even in those cases, it saw its involvement as the protection of freedom and democracy. Not anymore.
So this, I mean, it could have been a joke, right? Like if he was trying to do like a bit of being a stupid news anchor. I mean, to just gloss over about 4 million deaths between Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, that isn't to count the other war on terror and other nefarious things the U.S. has done around the world over the past several decades. I mean, you're talking, again, about 4 or 5 million dead people, tens of millions of people displaced, entire countries destroyed. The country of Libya, utterly destroyed. At least Iraq still has its borders. Libya is just a fragmented country now with open slave markets. Utterly destroyed. Yemen, another country that is in the midst of a decades-long civil war. In Syria, we fought a decades-long civil war on the behalf of Al-Qaeda, and now a veteran of Al-Qaeda in Iraq sits on the throne in Damascus. And so to just gloss this over as we've made some well-intentioned mistakes is, again, just utter stupidity that you can almost not imagine somebody as in a high-ranking position of Fareed Zakaria could possibly be saying. But that is really what he's talking about here. And then he gets into this idea that our ultimate goal has to be to uphold democracy. And that's what we were doing in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Vietnam, which is just, I mean, obviously comical, as we saw and as documents revealed throughout the war, that even as we understood that that was no longer the mission, that this had just become, a conflict that we are embroiled in, and the next president was trying to, inflict as much death as possible on the enemy to make him look as good as possible. It really wasn't about exiting or helping the Vietnamese or the Iraqis or the Afghans. That was never the purpose of any of this. And for him to just, come up and give this completely fictional storybook narrative here about what has happened in American foreign policy, it is just absolutely insane. And yet that's what Zakaria is doing. So I have one more clip from his reaction to the Trump-Zelensky spat.
The strangest aspect of the last few weeks of American diplomacy that culminated in the disaster at the White House on Friday is that the President of the United States has seemed utterly unwilling to say plainly that he supports the victim of aggression against the aggressor, and that he admires Ukrainian democracy more than Russian dictatorship.
And so this is, again, just a great example of the black and white thinking. We'll see it throughout this episode as I go through some of these other people who are responding to what happened over the weekend. But this idea that they're going to continue to promote that Ukraine is some great democracy. A year ago or 2 years ago now covered this, I believe, at antiwar.com, that Zelensky banned his political opposition. The largest political opposition to Zelensky was simply removed from the parliament. Their assets were seized. Orthodox churches in Ukraine that are deemed to be too close to Moscow have had their leadership arrested. They've had their assets stolen. They've been outlawed. And then on top of all of it, he's nationalized the media. Ukraine used to at least have some diversity of media. It might have been different oligarchs promoting their thoughts, but Zelensky nationalized all of that. And now there's just one channel in Ukraine. I mean, this is truly Soviet level narrative and thought control going on in Ukraine. We've seen the videos of people being harassed over their posts online that they were deemed to not be supportive enough of Kyiv and their overall mission. And so that this is just some democracy versus dictatorship. That really isn't the case. Zelensky is a very authoritarian ruler, and it's important to understand that this just isn't some democracy. Now, as much of a joke and as unbelievable as this was put forward by Zakaria, Kristen Welker actually tops it, and this is a question she is phrasing to Mike Johnson. I think the reason it's important to actually sometimes take a second and look at the questions being asked by the host to the politicians is, in a lot of ways, the questions are so loaded, are so one-sided. They really are attempting to convey a message to the listener on what the listener should think. So let's play Kristen Welker here.
Okay, so just to put a fine point on that, you are saying that it might be necessary for President Zelensky to step down and not Putin. Do you want to see Putin step down?
So she's like baffled that Mike Johnson would say, oh, I would like to, Zelensky may need to resign. Well, Zelensky is also a year past the end of his term. A week ago, Zelensky was offering to resign if Kyiv was given NATO membership. And there are people within Ukraine who are not happy with the Ukrainian leadership. We will be running an article tomorrow at antiwar.com from Ted Snyder, where he goes through and breaks down that Zelensky's popularity in Ukraine may be as low as in the single digits, not the 4% presented by Donald Trump, but 16 to 9% seems to be a somewhat accurate range for Zelensky's popularity. So the idea here that we're going to just say that it would be absurd for Zelensky to resign after he's a year past his mandate. Remember, when he actually ran for president of Ukraine, he received a lot of support from the Russian-speaking regions, the Donbass, the regions of Ukraine with ethnic Russians. And that was because he was promising to enforce the Minsk agreement. He was going to bring an end to the Ukrainian civil war that was going to allow these regions to have a good amount of autonomy so they could preserve their cultural Russian heritage, but also remain a part of the Ukrainian state as they had since 1991 when the Soviet Union dissolved. And rather than enforcing that agreement, as Zelensky said he was going to do on the campaign trail, he actually undermined it and continued to attack the Donbass and refused to take the steps necessary to actually enforce Minsk and end the civil war in Ukraine. And ultimately, this is a part of what provoked Russia to invade Ukraine. And so that, that is truly an interesting way for Welker to frame the whole question, but also to challenge Johnson and say, well, do you want Putin to resign? Like, these are two equivalent things. If Johnson has a position on whether Zelensky needs to resign or not, well, that made some sense because Mike Johnson is responsible for the last $60 billion that the U.S. sent to Ukraine. And so in some way, the Ukrainian government only exists because Mike Johnson, as Secretary of State, played ball and sent Ukraine tens of billions of dollars. And so, yeah, that guy might have a statement, something to weigh in on whether Zelensky should resign or not. Mike Johnson has never sent Putin any money. Additionally, the idea that if he says we want Putin to resign or step down or be removed from power, well, that's going to be viewed as a threat from the Kremlin. And so that you would be challenging an American politician to say this is somewhat foolish. Mike Johnson should say this is up to the Republicans, and that's the way that it should be addressed. But they just want to force the Republicans to make inflammatory statements, because ultimately what Welker and the rest of the War Party wants is to keep this going. Now, another member of the War Party is now Bernie Sanders, and boy, does this old man really clown himself. So let's just play the first clip from Sanders here.
Do you think that President Zelensky needs to resign in order for there to be a peace deal?
I think that is a horrific suggestion. Zelensky is leading a country trying to defend democracy against an authoritarian dictator, Putin, who invaded his country. And I think millions of Americans are embarrassed, are ashamed that you have a president of the United States who says that Ukraine started the war, that Zelensky is a dictator. He's got it exactly backwards.
So the idea that it would be horrific to suggest that Zelensky step aside, when again, this is a man who's overstayed his election mandate. This is a man who said that the US sent us $177 billion worth of aid and military equipment, and I only know where $77 billion went. Well, that's a huge failing. That's a reason we should be asking Zelensky to resign. If Bernie Sanders calling this horrific is absolutely comical. And again, Bernie Sanders should have some understanding here of, for Trump to not be expected to constantly go around and say the most provocative thing towards Russia and Putin. I think Trump understands, and this is something that Trump said during the exchange with Zelensky. He's saying that you don't have a good hand to play. And I think, kind of by proxy, the Americans don't have a very good hand to play when it comes to the war in Ukraine. If this war of attrition continues to go on, Russia's going to continue to slowly take Ukrainian territory. They're going to wear down the Ukrainian war machine. They're going to blunt any kind of attack that Ukraine could wage. And sure, that's going to cost the Russians a lot over the next 2, 3, 4 years as they slowly chip away at the Ukrainian state, take more territory, and eventually enforce whatever kind of end to the war that they want. At the negotiating table, it'll just be a negotiating table where Zelensky is sitting at the barrel of a Russian gun and forced to sign whatever Putin puts in front of him. That's the situation if this war keeps going on. That's the situation that Ukraine's in. And so if Trump expects Putin to come to the table to make a deal when Putin understands that, yes, it may be a costly winning hand, but that he has the winning hand, I think Trump understands that he needs to be very careful in how he approaches Putin and how he words things, and not to be over inflammatory, and that we're criticizing Trump for choosing to be diplomatic about how he's approaching that is absolutely foolish. Now, I also think it's a mistake to be too confrontational with Zelensky. I think this is, aside from what happened in the Oval Office, where I think that was mostly on Zelensky for being very confrontational with Vance and Trump, but calling him a dictator prior to that is, I think Trump should understand that Zelensky, in a way, holds some cards over the Americans, where if he continues to fight, if he continues to launch strikes deep inside Russian territory, that this is going to continue to escalate tensions between NATO and Ukraine. And with so much European support for Ukraine, this could make it complicated for Trump trying to end the war if he doesn't have Zelensky on board. So I'm not saying he has to be particularly nice to Zelensky, but it's probably not a great idea to call him a dictator. I do have a second clip here from Senator Sanders, but first, just want to remind people, if you are on X watching the show live, go ahead, repost it, put it out there, get it out there to some more people. If you want to, head on over to the YouTube channel. That's where you could comment, subscribe. That way you all catch all the future episodes. And of course, if you got a comment, we be happy to address it, and ideas for future clips you'd like me to talk about. All right, let's move on to the second clip from Sanders.
The people of Ukraine have lost tens of thousands of soldiers. Their cities are being bombed as we speak. And our job is to defend the 250-year tradition that we have of being the democratic leader of the world, not turn our backs on a struggling country that is trying to do the right thing.
So this is absolutely baffling that Bernie Sanders would pretend to be on a moral high horse while absolutely rewriting American history and the founding principles of the United States of America. He's actually saying that America was founded on this idea that we'll go around the world and fight for freedom wherever, when our founders explicitly say the opposite. George Washington, the most famous part of his farewell address is to avoid entangling alliances. Everybody knows the John Quincy Adams speech where he says, America does not go around the world in search of monsters to destroy. But that's exactly what Bernie Sanders is saying that the Americans need to do, that the Americans have to do, that's what it means to be an American. It's absolutely absurd that he would flip American history on its head in an attempt to sell Americans on a war that we don't need to be involved in. Our leaders, our founder specifically said, stay out of Europe's messes, stay out of European wars. This is the way to American prosperity. You know, America can be that shining beacon on a hill. We could be a country where the Ukrainians and the Russians come, they sit down, they have a diplomatic settlement. Sure, America could play that role, but the idea that we need to pour hundreds of billions of dollars in weapons to a conflict where hundreds of thousands, millions of people may die is simply disgusting. And to try to package the best part of America's founding and to turn it around and distort it to sell a current war is, you know, I hope Bernie Sanders is just old and demented, but I think he's just, you know, a really twisted person and will say whatever he needs to try to push whatever political agenda that he thinks is important at the time. So next up here, we have some clips from Senator Chris Murphy. He's a Democrat from Connecticut. Let's play the first clip.
It is absolutely shameful what is happening right now. The White House has become an arm of the Kremlin. Every single day, you hear from the National Security Advisor, from the President of the United States, from his entire national security team, Kremlin talking points. For the last week, the White House has been pretending as if Ukraine started this war. That's essentially saying that Poland invaded Germany at the beginning of World War II. There are still facts in this world. And the fact is this: Vladimir Putin is a brutal dictator.
So as fun as and easy as it is to beat up on Bernie Sanders, who's this old man and who knows how well his brain works anymore, Chris Murphy is one of the Democrats' kind of leading thinkers on foreign policy. And also, he was one of the senators, along with John McCain, Lindsey Graham, and a few others who had gone over to Ukraine, who had helped facilitate the 2014 Euromaidan coup, and just was so involved in encouraging this Ukrainian nationalist government to rise up. He is ultimately responsible for setting events in motion that lead to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. When he says what the United States is doing is now shameful, and look, I do think that the United States probably owes it to Ukraine to try to exit this war and exit our support in a way that leaves Ukraine in the best state possible. And, you know, these Trump threats are not particularly great. At the same time, what is truly shameful is not what Trump is doing, but rather what happened under the Obama administration when Chris Murphy was instigating it, what happened under the first Trump administration, and then what happened under the Biden administration, where we told the Ukrainians time and time again that they could join the North Atlantic Alliance, that we slowly ratcheted up our military support for Kyiv and treated them more and more and more as a de facto member of the North Atlantic Alliance, provoking Russia to attack Ukraine. So we then had an opportunity to bleed and weaken Russia. I will never forget on the night of the invasion how gleeful that Hillary Clinton was, saying that Ukraine was going to be another Afghanistan for Russia. In the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, 1 to 2 million Afghans died. That wasn't a good war for Afghanistan. The Soviets did horrific things to the Afghans during their decade occupation there. And so the idea that any American politician who pretends to care about Ukraine is going to be gleeful of a Russian invasion is a truly demented and sick person. But all these people were happy because their ultimate goal was to weaken Russia. And so that is what's truly shameful. Let's play this next clip from Murphy.
Russia started this war. And the entire pretext for that meeting yesterday was an attempt to rewrite history in order to sign a deal with Putin that hands Putin Ukraine. That is disastrous for U.S. national security. That means that China will be on the march. Putin may not stop. America may be at war with a nuclear power. And for what? For what?
And I really hate this argument that we hear time and time again from American politicians that if Russia wins in Ukraine, then first of all, Putin is just going to march clear across Europe. That Putin's goal is to take Ukraine and not just the 4 regions of Ukraine that he's annexed so far. That's completely absurd. But this idea that actually what Ukraine represents is Taiwan. And if Russia wins in Ukraine, then China is going to win in Taiwan. And this is just not only stupid, but actually counterproductive, right? Because if the United States continues to pour hundreds of billions of dollars into Ukraine, and we continue to send all of our military assets to Ukraine and have this massive military buildup in Europe, there's going to be offsetting costs. There's a limit to how many weapons that the United States could produce, how many Patriot interceptors we have in our arsenal. And if we send those to Ukraine, if we deploy these assets to Europe, that means they're not going to Taiwan. If we bankrupt ourselves backing the Ukrainians, then how are we going to ever bankrupt ourselves backing the Taiwanese? And so it's really a backwards argument, and it doesn't make any sense. But American politicians just say it time and time and time again, and people just assume it's true because this is supposed to be a distinguished senator who understands American foreign policy. He's a leading thinker on U.S. foreign policy. He has a Biden consideration to be Secretary of State, so he's somebody we should take seriously. And yet he makes these statements about that this is going to be a sign to China that they could take Taiwan when the two situations are completely different. And again, if the United States is pouring all of our assets into Ukraine, then what are we going to have to support Taiwan? All right, one more clip from Murphy here.
It appears as if America is trying to align itself with dictators, that Donald Trump wants us to have our closest relationships with despots all around the world, because that makes it easier for him to transition America into a kleptocratic oligarchy where Elon Musk and Donald Trump rule and steal from the American people.
So again, absolutely comical, has no basis in reality. Look at who the United States has allied themselves with for decades. The Saudis, the Jordanians, the Egyptians. We bet the South Korean government when they were very tyrannical for a long time. The United States does not have a problem with backing dictators. Again, as I mentioned at the top of the show, we helped to put Al-Qaeda in Syria in charge of Damascus. We will bat the bad guys if we think it weakens our greater geopolitical foes, like Iran, like Russia. And so there's really not this white hat, black hat dynamic that Chris Murphy likes to put forward. But then he goes on this paranoid, delusional rant where he's saying that, Trump just wants to align himself with dictators. And so he could do dictator things here at home. President Joe Biden embraced time and time again Benjamin Netanyahu as he was carrying out ethnic cleansing. If Trump wanted to have some kind of excuse to expel all the Mexicans from the United States or have some super aggressive immigration policy, then he should align himself with Netanyahu, not Vladimir Putin. And yet nobody takes a shot. Nobody's concerned about the U.S. relationship with Israel, certainly not Chris Murphy or anybody that we've heard from who's been critical of Biden today. All right, I do have a statement from another senator. This one is Van Hollen from Maryland.
I saw the meeting as a despicable display of bullying by the President of the United States and the Vice President of the United States against somebody whose country is at war with Putin, a brutal assault by Putin, who's lost thousands and thousands of Ukrainians, who wants peace more than anybody, but he also wants to make sure that it's a durable, sustainable peace.
So the idea that Zelensky wants peace more than anyone was funny when Van Hollen said it at the time, but since Zelensky has said that peace isn't going to come for a very, very long time. So this just isn't based in reality at all. It's not that Zelensky wants peace. Zelensky has this completely unattainable, unrealistic idea for peace where Ukraine is going to retake the Donbass, retake the southern Ukrainian republics, retake the Crimean Peninsula. This is never going to happen. Russia will continue to escalate the war, continue to bomb and reduce Ukrainian cities into rubble. Again, Russia will win this war of attrition in the long run. It may cost Russia a lot. And if I were a Russian, I would be pretty horrified at the expense that my government is willing to pay to win this war. But at the same time, as an American, I have to recognize this dynamic and to continue to feed Ukrainians into the meat grinder to weaken Russia, because Washington thinks that one day they're going to have to fight a war against China. And because we've blundered our way into China and Russia being in a near military alliance, we feel like we have to weaken Russia. I mean, this is just an awful blood price for Ukraine to pay to reach that goal. So one of the most interesting reactions of what happened on Friday, this meeting between Trump and Zelensky, was Lindsey Graham. And I just have to play this clip for everyone. I think it's fantastic.
I've busted my try to help Ukraine to make sure we help them win a war that would, get this war over in a way that we don't have further aggression, and Donald Trump's the man to do it. I told him this morning, I told him, don't take the bait. Don't let the media or anybody else get you into a argument with President Trump. What he's doing today is resetting the relationship. You should be grateful.
So, in a way, I think this is actually like a very honest assessment from Lindsey Graham, somebody who I don't think is usually particularly honest and is just repeating the war propaganda. Here, I think we hear his genuine frustration that he's mad that Zelensky screwed up on the public relations front in this meeting, and that a deal would have been done. And I think Graham celebrating this deal. Remember, this is something that I have been talking about and warning about since November, when it first came up by Graham, when he said, I have this idea, Ukraine has all these minerals, the U.S. could take these minerals and then we could give Ukraine weapons in return. And I've been very concerned about that Trump was going to fall for that bait, to buy into that. And I think Graham really thought that he had this all set up and sealed on Friday, and then Zelensky went and absolutely blew it up. So I have one more take on this. This is from another Republican senator, Senator Langford.
No, we're not turning our back on Ukraine, nor should we. Putin is a murderous KGB thug that murders his political enemies and is a dictator there. And so we've seen that. We've seen his aggression. Countries around him have seen that. Obviously, the Ukrainian people have seen that. The challenge is now we're at a stalemate. This is a World War I-like trench warfare, and it is best to be able to get to at least a pause. And what I hear President Trump saying over and over again is we need to get to a stop in fighting, find some resolution. I understand Zelensky is rightfully concerned that Putin has violated every single agreement he's ever signed and that he can't be trusted. He's looking for some kind of security guarantees, which the French and the UK are saying they want to put troops in. But we need to get these two folks at the table, get to some kind of resolution to something that may look like North and South Korea for a long time, and have a line where people are looking at each other, but not an active war.
So the idea that we're going to turn East and West Ukraine into North and South Korea should be absolutely horrifying and raise many red flags, but he just says that like this is good policy going forward. Now, one of the other reasons I want to play this clip is because he says something that was repeated, one of the probably top 5 kind of slogans over the past weekend, which was that Russia has broken every deal that they've been in, and this is why the Ukrainians need all these assurances and weapons and everything. This is just absurd. This isn't what happened with the Minsk agreement. If anything, it was the Ukrainians who violated, who never implemented those deals. Zelensky said during his feud with Trump there that Russia had agreed to prisoner exchanges that they never allowed. And actually, Zelensky had celebrated those prisoner exchanges and swaps in the past. So that they had happened. And I'm not saying that Russia followed the Minsk agreement to the letter and was perfect, but the Ukrainians certainly violated it more than the Russians did. Now, before we wrap today, I really want to spend a minute talking about the situation in Gaza. It's really getting horrific there. Once again, and it's not getting as much attention because of everything happening with Ukraine. Understandably so, there's a capacity for how much news could be covered, but this cannot be left unsaid. So let's go ahead and play our first clip from Netanyahu.
According to the Witkoff proposal, on the first day of his framework, half of the hostages will be released in one phase. At the end of the framework, if agreement is reached, the remaining hostages will be released, also in one phase. Steve Witkoff proposed a framework for extending the ceasefire after gaining the impression that there is no possibility at present of bridging between the two positions. Regarding the second stage, that additional time for talks was necessary in order to achieve a possible agreement.
So what's really important here, and this is needs a little bit of background to what Netanyahu is kind of laying out, but basically the ceasefire was supposed to be 3 stages. The first phase was supposed to be 6 weeks, which actually ended on Saturday. And during that first phase, 33 living Israeli hostages were going to be exchanged for several thousand Palestinian prisoners, as well as aid coming into Gaza and a ceasefire during that period. During that time, Israel killed over 100 Palestinians, so they really weren't backing the ceasefire, although it was far less killing than they had been doing the previous 15 months. Additionally, Israel didn't allow in all the aid that they were supposed to, particularly temporary shelters and mobile homes that the people of Gaza desperately need, as over the past few weeks, 6 babies in Gaza have frozen to death. And so these shelters are desperately needed, and that Israel is depriving them of the Palestinians is killing more Palestinian children. It just awful what's happening there. And so rather than moving on to phase 2 of the agreement, as they were supposed to be negotiating on the past couple of weeks, Netanyahu first refused to negotiate. Then at the last minute, Netanyahu and the Americans came in and they told the Palestinians, we could extend phase 1 of this agreement, and you're going to release half of the remaining living hostages, which is estimated to be about 12, in one full swap. And then in a few weeks, you'll release the other half, and then we'll be done with the hostage releases. All the Israeli hostages will be released, and then we'll agree in the future to end the conflict and the fighting. Obviously, the Palestinians aren't going to go with this. The real incentives for the Palestinians were in phases 2 and 3 of the deal, which Netanyahu is making it clear that they will never go for. And so when the Palestinians said, no, that doesn't work for us, the Americans and the Israelis came out and they said, we tried to negotiate. The Palestinians wouldn't do it. We came in good faith. We put together a meaningful proposal, and the Palestinians, Hamas, you just know how them guys are. You can't negotiate with them. And so we have to go back to the fighting. And so Netanyahu is going to explain what we're going to see in the next couple weeks in this clip.
Upon the conclusion of the first stage, and in light of Hamas' rejection of the Witkoff framework, we decided at last night's discussion that as of this morning, the entry of goods and supplies into Gaza will be prevented. It must be emphasized, Hamas currently controls all of the supplies and goods that are being sent to the Gaza Strip. It is abusing the Gazan population that is trying to receive the aid. It is shooting at them and is turning the humanitarian aid into a budget for terrorism directed against us. To this, we will not agree in any way. If Hamas continues to stick to its position and does not release our hostages, there will be additional consequences, which I will not detail here. As of today, we have returned 196 hostages, and I remind you that at the start of the war, there were those who doubted our ability to return even one hostage. Again, we demand the release of all our hostages, the living and the deceased. We are committed to this. I am committed to this, and with God's help, we will neither stop nor be silent until we achieve it.
So this is an absolute horror, blocking all the aid from entering Gaza. This is a starvation campaign. This is meant to inflict mass suffering and mass death on the civilian population of Gaza. This is an absolute war crime. I believe it was the head of Human Rights Watch, or one of their top members, recently said that this makes what Israel is doing in Gaza a genocide. And so it's really important to take note of what Netanyahu laid out there. This campaign to block all aid into Gaza. And of course, he rolls out the typical Israeli propaganda points. All the aid goes to Hamas. This is found not to be the case. When different gangs in Gaza have stolen aid coming in, it's actually been gangs who are under the protection of the IDF, not Hamas, not the Israeli police force. And so, with that, everyone, thank you so much for listening to the show today. We had a lot of people listening live. If you're watching on ads, head on over to the YouTube channel and subscribe. That way you don't miss any of the future episodes of the Kyle ANZALONE Show. For those of you watching on YouTube, be sure to give us a thumbs up. Comment if you have any ideas on what we could do with the show. If you have any clips you want me to break down on future episodes of the show. Plenty to talk about in the coming week. So stay tuned. We'll be back with more episodes.